You've heard the story of slavery, but have you really? Why is it that among all the stories of pain, punishment, and slave quarters, we almost never hear about African kings and queens? What caused history to erase entire empires, advanced civilizations, and powerful black leaders? Get ready for a journey that goes beyond chains and slave ships, a dive into the heart of a truth hidden for centuries. If you want to understand slavery like you've never been told before, and uncover what really happened to Africa's royal thrones, then you can't miss this video. When you think of slavery, what's the first image that comes to your mind? Probably chains. Maybe a dark slave quarters, a whip held high, muffled screams of pain. It's always that, right? Pain, submission, dehumanization. But what if I told you that's only half the story? What if I told you that before they were enslaved, millions of Africans lived in prosperous, organized kingdoms with kings, queens, and majestic royal courts? Why weren't we ever taught this? In schools, the version of slavery we get is a surface-level script. Africans were brought to Brazil on slave ships, worked the sugar and coffee plantations, lived in slave quarters, and were eventually freed by Princess Isabel. But where are the names? Where are the voices? Where are the destroyed thrones, the silenced empires, the leaders who resisted? History isn't lying, it's choosing what to tell. And that silence, it's not accidental, it was crafted. By turning kings into slaves, the colonial elite built a world where black people weren't just physically oppressed, they were symbolically erased. African royalty disappeared from the textbooks. Empires were downgraded to primitive tribes, and dignity became invisible. And so over centuries, the collective imagination started to believe that Africans had always been submissive, as if slavery was their natural destiny. But who benefits from this erasure? This isn't just a historical issue, it's a question of power, because telling the truth that black men and women once ruled vast territories, built universities, mastered trade, math, philosophy, and art, would shake the very foundation of structural racism. It would prove that black inferiority never existed. It was invented. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe African kings' names were erased so that black people would grow up without heroes to look up to? That the absence of black royalty in history books isn't just an oversight, but a strategy. When you take away a people's past, you weaken their future. A tree without roots breaks more easily. That's why, even today, some people get uncomfortable when African royalty is mentioned. When someone speaks about the wisdom of Mansa Musa, the power of Queen Nzinga, the greatness of Timbuktu, it stirs a quiet fear. A fear that if these stories come back to light, they'll awaken pride. And with pride comes resistance. The slave system didn't end with abolition. It reinvented itself. And part of that reinvention is the control of the narrative. TV repeats the same stereotypes. Schools stay silent. The media decides who gets to be a genius, a hero, a role model. And almost never, it's a black face. This silence doesn't just hide history, it kills identity. For centuries, descendants of African kings were taught to see themselves with shame, to look at their features, their skin, their culture as something less than. But what if they had known their true story? What if they had learned they came from palaces, not just slave quarters? Slavery didn't start on the slave ship. It started long before, with the dismantling of African nations, with the destruction of their records, with the demonization of their languages, their religions, their traditions, with replacing memory with silence. And that silence still echoes today. They say history is written by the winners. But what if the winners were just the ones who were best at burning the books of others? What if, by digging through the ashes, we can still find the names they tried to erase? Can you imagine what it would feel like for a descendant of enslaved people to discover they're actually heirs to royal bloodlines, that in their veins flows the same strength of kings and queens who once ruled entire continents? So the question that won't go away is, who were these African kings and queens? Where did they live? How did they rule? And more importantly, why did history work so hard to keep us away from them? Before the chains wrapped around wrists and whips tore into backs, there were thrones. There were golden crowns, towering fortresses built with advanced mathematics, libraries with thousands of manuscripts. Long before the word slavery became synonymous with Africa, that continent was beating with culture, science, and power. And it was precisely that Africa, majestic, refined, powerful, that was erased, so the story could fit the colonizers' narrative. In the west of the continent rose the Ghana Empire, thriving between the 8th and 11th centuries. Not to be confused with the modern country, this empire was a regional superpower, controlling trade routes between the Sahara and the African forest. Its wealth came from gold, and its political structure was strong. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was a spiritual icon, a military leader, a guardian of tradition. But if Ghana was impressive, what came next was even greater. In the 13th century, the Mali Empire revealed to the world one of the greatest symbols of black wealth and leadership, Mansa Musa. On his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, he carried so much gold that he crashed the value of the metal across Egypt and the Middle East for a decade. Mansa Musa was a visionary. Under his rule, the city of Timbuktu became a hub of knowledge, rivaling Europe's most elite cities. There stood the University of Sankore with over 25,000 students in the heart of the Middle Ages. While Europe was ravaged by the Black Plague and widespread illiteracy, Timbuktu had philosophers, astronomers, engineers. African manuscripts from centuries ago discussed planets, algebra, ethics, medicine, and all of this was ignored, or worse, destroyed by those who would later sell their descendants as property. To the north, the Songhai Empire expanded the region's glory even further. Its armies controlled vast territories. Its administrative system rivaled any European monarchy. Cities like Gao and Jenne were booming trade centers, dealing in fabrics, horses, gold, and salt. All of this was managed, protected, legislated by black kings who mastered the art of diplomacy and warfare. So why is this part of history left out? Because it shatters a foundational myth of racism, the myth of primitive Africa. If they admitted that the Africans who were enslaved came from empires with kings, palaces, and universities, how could they justify treating them like animals when they arrived at the ports of Brazil or the Americas? Erasing those origins wasn't a mistake. It was essential to sustain centuries of dehumanization. While European kings are taught with reverence, African kings are treated like legends. The stories of Mansa Musa, Sundiata Keita, Queen Nzinga, and so many others are ignored in textbooks. And when they do appear, they're almost always reduced to caricatures, folklore, or exotic trivia. This isn't forgetfulness, this is erasure. The slave ships didn't depart from a void. They tore people from organized societies, from families, from ancient cultures. Many of those thrown into the ship holds could read, spoke multiple languages, practiced traditional medicine, and knew a world far beyond their village. The trauma of slavery was also the trauma of being ripped away from a past filled with greatness. Once you understand that, everything changes. The image of the ignorant African slave crumbles, and in its place appears someone who was once a king, someone who had studied, someone who had seen the world through the eyes of a leader before being reduced to a number, burned into their skin. These civilizations didn't disappear because they were weak. They were attacked, They were sabotaged, leaders were corrupted, kingdoms were divided, rivalries were stirred up by European colonizers, eager to open the doors for human trafficking. It wasn't fate, it was strategy. It was psychological and economic warfare. So the next time someone says African slavery was natural or that it always existed, remember this: there was once an Africa of kings and queens, an Africa of intellectuals and architects. And they weren't enslaved because they were inferior. They were enslaved because they were a threat to the colonial project. But how did these powerful, organized empires fall? Who betrayed them? And how did Europe turn them into targets of slavery? Gold once gleamed in the hands of African rulers. Caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying salt, fine fabrics, knowledge and stories passed down for generations. There was order, there was power. But it all began to fall apart when white sails appeared on the horizon. They weren't clouds, they were Portuguese ships, and with them came the beginning of a silent and devastating plan to turn gold into flesh. The first contact between Europeans and Africans wasn't violent, it was seductive. The Portuguese arrived with exotic goods and tempting trade offers. In exchange for gold, ivory and spices, they offered guns, cloth, mirrors and, most dangerously, promises. But behind the deals lay a much darker intent: to create dependency, divide kingdoms and corrupt alliances. Some African leaders, caught in internal conflicts, accepted deals with the newcomers. They handed over prisoners of war, political rivals, even their own people, thinking they were forming useful alliances. They didn't know they were feeding a machine of destruction that would never stop. They didn't know they were opening the gates of hell. As Europeans realized the profits to be made from slavery, they stopped trading like partners and started acting like predators. They built coastal trading posts, human markets, where thousands of Africans were examined, chained, and shipped off into pain. The African coastline became a death corridor, all of it backed by the Portuguese crown, and later other European powers. The justification for this brutality was always the same: Africans were uncivilized, soulless, and in need of salvation. But it was all a lie. They knew about the empires. They knew about Timbuktu. They knew they were destroying entire nations, but they chose to erase everything to justify their profits. Over time, Africa became a continent divided, monitored, and manipulated. Allied tribes were turned against each other. Ancient kingdoms were dismantled. Civil wars were encouraged by the very colonizers who hid in the shadows, offering weapons and promises in exchange for captives. It was a perfect trap. Destroy from within to exploit from the outside. Slave ships that once carried goods were now built to carry people. No longer chests of gold, but holds full of men. No longer peace agreements, but ownership papers. Slavery became not just a temporary trade, but a global industry. And Africa became the inexhaustible source of labor that would build the wealth of Europe and the Americas. Meanwhile, the voices warning against this silent alliance were silenced or discredited. Kings who resisted, like Nzinga and many others, were labeled savages, rebels, enemies of the faith. Anyone who tried to stop slavery was painted as an obstacle to progress. The world was being trained to believe that some were born to rule and others to serve. The cruelty of the slave trade wasn't only in the chains, it was in the cold documents, the royal seals, the priests' prayers blessing the ships before departure. It was such a well-crafted system that it turned African kings into suppliers of slaves, while Europe built the image of Africa as a wild, uncivilized land to justify its plunder. This was the most treacherous phase of colonialism, the manipulation disguised as partnership. Europe didn't invade all at once. First, it seduced. It didn't scream, it whispered. And when Africans realized what was happening, most of the thrones had already fallen. That's why it's so important to tell this part of the story, because it shows that slavery wasn't some inevitable evil. It was a project, designed, structured, executed by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Men who destroyed empires for profit, who silenced kings for convenience, who turned Africa into a vast hunting ground for human beings. But what happened inside those ships? That's a truth not everyone is ready to hear. Are you prepared to descend into the bowels of the slave trade? Imagine being locked in a dark, cramped hold so low you can't even stand. Around you, dozens of bodies are pressed against yours. Some cry, others scream. Most are silent. Breathing is hard. The air is hot, foul, thick with feces, blood, and despair. This is where the journey of the slave ships began. They were called tumbeiros, ships packed with living people, treated like dead cargo. Africans were stacked like sacks, chained by the ankles and wrists, many tied together. There was no room to turn. Men were packed in rows, separated from women and children. The journey could last weeks, even months, and every second inside was another step toward hell. These conditions weren't accidental, they were intentional. The less the enslaved moved, the more efficient the transport. The weaker the body, the less likely they were to resist upon arrival. Diseases spread fast: dysentery, smallpox, scurvy. The smell of death was constant. Those who died were thrown overboard like trash. Many still alive, mistaken for corpses, were tossed into the sea as well. Women suffered a horror even more grotesque. Raped by sailors, many became pregnant during the voyage. Some threw themselves overboard. Others killed their own newborns to spare them a life of torture. The screams from the hold weren't just pain. They were resistance, grief, and helplessness. The children, they didn't even have time to understand. Torn from their mother's arms, pushed among crying, shouting adults, not knowing what the ship was, not knowing they were leaving behind not just their land, but their entire identity. Many died before reaching shore. Those who survived lost the right to dream. There was a man aboard called the overseer. His job was to keep order, which meant whipping, punishing, humiliating. The crack of lashes echoed through the wooden boards. Those who tried to rebel were dismembered. Those who cried too loud were flogged. Some were forced to dance on deck to keep circulation, while Europeans laughed, drinks in hand. The enslaved were given the bare minimum: a bit of dirty water, a handful of flour, nothing but pain. They slept in their own urine, on the corpses of the dead. Some chose death, and for many, death was freedom. There are stories of entire groups jumping overboard together in silence, eyes closed, hands held, but not all could escape. Most were brought alive to the ports of Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, the United States. They arrived with cracked skin, bones bruised by chains, and empty eyes. And the moment they touched land, they ceased to be human. They became a new name, a number, a price. A journey that began with royalty, ended in shackles, and became commerce. The slave ship was the cursed womb of a new world, a world built on pain, on separation, on erasure. Millions crossed the ocean in conditions so cruel there aren't enough words to describe. It was the largest mass abduction in human history, and yet, for a long time, it was labeled simply as trade. With every voyage, a piece of Africa died. With every ship hold, a bloodline was broken. With every body thrown into the sea, a story was lost. Slave ships didn't just carry enslaved people. They carried disguised kings, silent sages, mutilated mothers, and children ripped from the womb of memory. And when these ships finally docked at Brazil's ports, there was no welcome. There was an auction, and a new pain began. Because if the ship's hold was hell, what awaited in the slave quarters was even worse. But what happened once they arrived in Brazil? What was the final fate of those who survived the sea? The slave quarters were not just places to sleep. They were places of confinement, punishment, and forgetting. Cramped, poorly ventilated spaces with dirt floors and maybe a few straw mats, when there were any. At night, tired bodies would collapse there. But rest was a luxury rarely afforded. Work began before the sun rose and ended only when the overseer decided it was over. The overseer was the most feared figure among the enslaved. The armed hand of the plantation master, he dealt out punishment with sadistic pleasure. Any act deemed disobedience, a glance, a delay, could result in a whipping session in front of everyone. Their scarred backs became maps of unending pain. The system was designed not just to break bodies, but to shatter spirits. African names were replaced with Portuguese ones. Religions were banned. Languages were silenced. Those who tried to keep their faith or practice their rituals were accused of witchcraft and punished. It was as if they wanted to erase souls and rewrite them in white. At the other end of the plantation stood the big house. There, the masters lived in abundance: wine, porcelain, imported dresses, lavish parties, all funded by the blood dripping in the slave quarters. While one group starved and suffered, the other toasted to progress and civilization. And the most cruel part, they believed they were doing the right thing. It was common for slave owners to quote the Bible to justify slavery. They claimed black people were cursed, that they were born to serve, that they were being civilized by the grace of God. This narrative didn't just support the system, it helped ease the conscience of those keeping it alive. But the truth was something else. Slavery wasn't civilization, it was profit. Every black body was worth money. It was an economic engine. Children were born enslaved. Women were exploited for labor and for sex. Men were production machines. All of it reduced to numbers in the plantation owner's ledger. Even within the slave quarters, there were divisions. Some enslaved people worked in the fields, exposed to the sun, to harsh punishment. Others, known as house slaves, worked inside the big house. But they didn't escape violence, only traded a hoe for humiliating stares and constant abuse. No place was safe, no role was free from degradation. Some resisted through small acts, breaking a tool, escaping for a night, secretly teaching African languages, but each act of courage could cost them their life. Punishment was public, to set an example. And the quarters which at night held forced sleep became by day a stage for blood, pain, and tears. And yet, there was strength. There was faith. There were mothers singing forbidden African lullabies to their children in whispers. There were glances exchanged in silence, recognizing one another as kin. There were exhausted bodies that still danced in secret to keep ancestry alive. Brazilian slavery was one of the longest and most violent in the world. It lasted over 300 years, and its echoes are still present in today's social inequality, structural racism, and exclusion. But even in the slave quarters, even with chains around their ankles, the desire for freedom was never erased. And it was from that desire that the Quilombos were born. Free territories where pain became resistance and escape became revolution. If the slave quarters represented captivity, the Quilombo was a shout for freedom. In a world that conspired to erase black identity, spaces rose up that refused to die in silence. Places where ancestry was sacred, the body was free, and the fight became law. Quilombos were not just places of refuge, they were revolutions in the shape of communities. Escaping a plantation, crossing dense forests, fleeing from bounty hunters, and surviving without support was nearly impossible. But even so, thousands tried, and many succeeded, some alone, others in groups. Each escape was an act of courage. Each step into the forest a declaration: I refuse to be a slave. These fugitives formed Quilombos, villages hidden in the hinterlands, in the hills, in the woods. built with their own hands with wood, clay, faith and blood. There they rebuilt families, practiced African religions, farmed, hunted, taught. The Quilombo was home, school, temple and fortress, all in one. The most famous was the Quilombo dos Palmares in the Serra da Barriga, Alagoas. For nearly a century, Palmares resisted colonial attacks. It was more than a hideout. It was a city with thousands of residents, political structure, its own laws, and a trained army. At its helm, two names still echo as symbols of resistance, Zumbi and Dandara. Zumbi of Palmares wasn't just a military leader, he stood for autonomy, dignity, memory. Trained in war from a young age, he knew how white men thought, but chose to defend his people. Dandara, his partner, was just as fierce. She fought with weapons and strategy, led troops, organized escapes, and protected women from both external and internal violence. The Quilombos were the nightmare of the slave-owning elite, not just because they meant economic losses, but because they proved that black people could self-govern, that they didn't need white control, that they were capable of organizing complex, egalitarian, free societies, everything the colonial narrative tried to hide. That's why Palmares was hunted with fury. For years, military expeditions were sent to destroy it. In 1694, after many battles, it was finally invaded and burned by troops under Domingos Jorge Velho. A year later, Zumbi was captured and killed. His head was cut off and displayed in a public square. The message was clear. Resistance came at a price. But the slave masters didn't realize that Zumbi in death would be more powerful than in life. His name became legend. His spirit spread from mouth to mouth, Quilombo to Quilombo, until it became a national symbol of black resistance. Today, November 20th, the day of his death, is remembered as Black Consciousness Day in Brazil. And Palmares wasn't alone. There was Quilombo do Ambrosio, Campo Grande, Jabaquara, Buraco do Tatu, Leblon, each with its own story, pain and strategy. They are living proof that black people never accepted slavery passively. There was always resistance, always uprising, always fire. The existence of Quilombos shatters the myth of black passivity. They show that even without weapons, without support, without resources, there was strength. And where there is strength, there is memory. And where there is memory, there is future. But even with all of this, why do school books still barely mention these leaders? Why were Zumbi and Dandara silenced for so long? And more importantly, why were we never told who the kings and queens were before slavery? Did you know there were African kings with more gold than all of Europe combined? Then why were those names erased from our history? You may have grown up hearing that black people came from tribes, that they lived in jungles without kings, laws, or history. You may have thought Africa was only a land of poverty, destined to be exploited. But none of that is true. What happened was a cruel operation. History erased black kings and queens to turn thrones into chains. Before they were enslaved, many Africans were subjects or even descendants of respected monarchs. Men and women who ruled with wisdom, diplomacy, and strategy, who commanded armies, maintained international trade, and supported science, art, and religion. And among them, perhaps the most extraordinary, was Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa, emperor of Mali in the 14th century, was described by Arab historians as the richest man who ever lived. His wealth was so immense that during a single pilgrimage to Mecca, he carried tons of gold and distributed so much that he caused inflation in Egypt for over a decade. But Mansa Musa wasn't just rich. He was educated, a devout Muslim, and a patron of schools and libraries. Yet, Dreshus, have you ever seen his name in a school book? And he wasn't alone. The story of Nzinga Mbande, Queen of Ndongo and Matamba, modern-day Angola, is a battle cry. A sharp diplomat, military strategist, and political leader, she stood toe-to-toe with Portuguese colonizers. She dressed as a king to command respect in patriarchal spaces, formed alliances, led her people through battles for decades. But why do Brazilians know more about European princesses than about this black queen who defied empires? Another name erased is Sundiata Keita, founder of the Mali Empire, a legend still sung and celebrated across West Africa. He united tribes and laid the foundation for one of Africa's golden ages. His story is told in epic poetry passed down for generations, but it's missing from most Western curriculums. This erasure wasn't carelessness, it was policy. By suppressing Africa's great leaders, colonizers built a dangerous idea that black people never had power, never ruled, never created or led, and that lie still feeds racism today. By removing all references to black authority, brilliance, and royalty. When the only black figures you see in school books are the enslaved, the marginalized, or the freed, the collective imagination molds itself around inferiority. And entire generations grow up believing they came from nothing, that they were always dominated, that they never wore crowns, held swords, or shaped their own destiny. That is violence, a subtle, continuous, and structural violence. Even when they are mentioned, black kings and queens are often portrayed as exotic, folklore figures with colorful clothes and tribal dances. But in truth, they ruled complex civilizations with economies, legal codes, religions, and universities. Meanwhile, every European king, even the bloodiest, is remembered with reverence. European castles became tourist attractions. White history became pride. But African palaces were destroyed, burned, and buried in the dust of forgetting. Their memories turned to smoke, except in those who carry the stories in their skin. That's why reclaiming these names and biographies is a revolutionary act. It's rewriting the world with truth. It's telling every black boy that he doesn't come from a slave hut. He comes from kingdoms. It's telling every black girl that before the chains there were crowns, and they can still shine. Little by little, research, documentaries, and scholars have begun to revive these figures. But for a long time, white academia ignored them, wasn't interested, didn't investigate. Because recognizing black royalty means facing the deepest fear of a racist society, that black power is real, legitimate, and ancestral. And maybe that's why even today there's so much discomfort when we talk about black pride, ancestry, or black leadership, because truth is a threat to those who have always profited from lies. Did you learn about Mansa Musa in school, or about Queen Nzinga? Do you know what the Songhai Empire was? Probably not, and that's no accident. There's an entire system that still operates today to keep this part of history hidden, not with chains or whips, but with silence, omissions, and repetitions that teach only one thing, that black people never had a glorious past. From early on, we're taught to admire European kings, Roman generals, and Egyptian pharaohs. But Africa, when shown in textbooks, is almost always a backdrop for poverty, tribal wars, or slavery. Schools choose what to teach, and what they chose was to erase black greatness from our collective memory. This erasure isn't just about names, it's about representation. It's about growing up without role models. A black child who never sees heroes that look like them grows up believing they don't belong in any place of honor. When books only show white people as thinkers, scientists, and leaders, they create a pattern of superiority that carries across generations. And on TV, it's no different. For decades, black people only appeared as slaves, criminals, maids, comedians, or athletes. Black royalty never had space, and when it did appear, it was caricatured, romanticized, or pushed into the background. The media shapes the imagination, and imagination builds reality. In advertising, in soap operas, in films, in universities, where is the real Africa? Where are the intellectuals, the engineers, the kings, the poets? Nowhere. Because the system knows that showing this truth is transformative. and transformation frightens those who have always held power. This project of invisibility is intentional. It's not a glitch in the system, it is the system, because a people without memory is a people easier to control. And as long as black people keep believing their story starts with slavery, racism will continue to disguise itself as normal. Academia also bears responsibility. For a long time, universities dismissed Afro-centered studies. The reading lists were, and often still are, 90% European, few black professors, few opportunities to speak, and when black scholars offer another perspective, they're labeled radicals, as if knowledge could only have one point of view, the white one. But little by little, that structure is cracking. Black teachers and researchers are rewriting history. They're translating forgotten African manuscripts. They're rescuing oral memory, traditions, worldviews. It's slow, like ants working, but powerful, because every recovered name, every unearthed truth is a crown returned. Even so, there's resistance. It's not uncommon to see bills trying to block anti-racist education. Some parents are uncomfortable when their children learn that Brazil was built on the genocide of black people. There is a silent fear, a fear that, if the truth spreads, the power structures that uphold society might collapse. And maybe that fear is justified, because when a people discovers their true history, they no longer accept just any place. They demand respect, they take up space, they challenge the narratives, they understand they didn't come from nothing, and they weren't born to be side characters. So the question is there still time to reverse all this? Is it possible to recover what was lost, or has so much been erased that nothing remains? What if I told you that black memory survived, alive, strong, and pulsing, even when everything was done to bury it? They tried to erase it all. They burned books, banned languages, mocked rituals, spread fear, gave African people European names. And even then, memory survived, not in official books, not in political speeches, but in bodies, music, food, words, dances, and religions. Africa never left black people. It was only hidden in the margins of survival. When enslaved people were forbidden from praying to their gods, they disguised their Oryxas with Catholic saints' names. That's how syncretism was born. Zango became Saint Jerome, Yemanja, Our Lady, Oxóssi, Saint Sebastian, Candomblé, Umbanda, and other Afro-Brazilian religions became fortresses of spiritual resistance. In them, ancestry lived on, dancing to the sound of the atabaque drums. Capoeira circles were also gestures of rebellion and memory. Disguised as dance, they were combat training. Every movement, every beat of the berimbau carried the secrets of ancient warriors. While the masters saw games, bodies were preparing for escape, for battle, for freedom. Capoeira is Africa in motion. Cuisine preserved the roots too. Palm oil, okra, acarajé, vatapá, all of it came from African wisdom. Recipes passed from mother to daughter, from terreiro to kitchen. Every spice is a cry of identity. To eat is to resist, when your food carries the story of those who came before you. Without the African drum, Brazilian music would be silent. Samba, maracatu, jongo, afoxé, all of it was born from the pain and celebration of black people, because even in pain, black people sing. They sing to endure, to remember, to declare their existence. Each drumbeat says, memory is here, alive and beating. And it's also in curly hair, in braids, in patterned clothes, in speech, in the way we walk. It's in the way our bodies move, how our eyes lift, how our smiles open. Even without realizing it, many descendants of Africans carry traits of ancient kingdoms in their daily lives, because culture is more stubborn than forgetting. Orality was one of the greatest weapons of resistance. When writing wasn't allowed, knowledge was passed by voice. Stories, proverbs, songs, myths. A grandmother telling her grandson a tale is actually passing down a fragment of an African kingdom. In this context, words are worth more than gold. And they were used to keep the flame alive. Even in the places where oppression was strongest, memory found a way to bloom. In quilombos, in terreiros, in samba schools, in favelas. Africa never left. It reinvented itself. It adapted. Because Africa isn't just territory, it's spirit, legacy, root. And no matter how many times you try to cut the root, it grows back. Black ancestry isn't nostalgia, it's presence, it's politics, it's identity. When a black child learns about African kings and queens, when they understand they didn't come from nothing, they reconnect with a lineage of strength. They understand their hair isn't a problem, it's a crown. Their skin isn't a curse, it's an inheritance. Today, this memory is rising with force. In black culture museums, in poetry nights, in slams, in podcasts, in books, in art shows, in youth pounding their chests and saying, "I'm the child of kings." This wave is impossible to stop, because it's not a trend, it's reconnection, it's healing, it's a reunion with a stolen history. Black memory survived because black people refused to forget. And that alone is one of the greatest victories against the project of enslavement. They tried to make slavery a full stop, but it became an ellipsis, because where there's memory, there's a future. And where there's a future, there's a revolution. But if this memory still survives, why does it still make people so uncomfortable? Why are they still trying to silence black pride? Why does black memory scare people? Why so much resistance when a black youth sees himself as heir to kings, as child of ancestry? The answer is direct and uncomfortable, because a people who know where they come from becomes impossible to control, and that has always terrified those in power. The fear of black power didn't start with freedom. It started before abolition, when whites saw quilombos growing, capoeira becoming more than dance, and Afro-Brazilian religions becoming more than rituals. They were culture, they were identity, they were organization, they were power. That's why repression didn't end with slavery, it just changed form. Capoeira was criminalized, candomblé was persecuted, temples were raided. Black people, now free, were thrown into poverty, with no land, no wages, no schools. And when they tried to gather, to express themselves, to wear what they wanted, they were watched and punished. The criminalization of black culture is not an accident. It's a strategy, a way to keep black people away from any idea of autonomy, to cut the root before it grows, to silence the drum before it awakens memory. And the more black people rise, the more they're told they're exaggerating, playing victim, whining. The fear runs so deep, it spans generations. It's in the discomfort when a black woman wears her natural hair. It's in the shock when a black man walks into a university. It's in the tension when he becomes a manager. It's in the silent fury when he demands respect without lowering his head. This fear has a name: structural racism, a system that prefers a submissive black person over a questioning one, that accepts black people in samba, but not in politics. That's fine with a black cook, but not a black CEO. That smiles at black actors as long as they don't speak too much about their pain. When black people become aware of their true origins, they break the invisible chains still holding them down. They stop accepting crumbs. They demand space, voice, and reparations. And that scares people, because it challenges the historical privileges of those who've always been on top. That's why there's so much effort to discredit black movements, to mock anti-racist causes, to downplay November 20th. To minimize the importance of terreiros, quilombos, black universities, black authors, because the system knows where there is black consciousness, there is rebellion against the order that always oppressed. But the truth is that fear can no longer stop us, because it's based on a lie that black people should settle for what they're given, and we're not accepting that anymore. The fear of black power exists because black power is real. It pulses in the veins of those who survived the slave ship, the slave quarters, the favela, the bullet. And if there's still resistance today, it's because the system knows when black people rise, the world trembles, and that rise has already begun. It's in the books, on the screens, in the streets, in collectives, in conversations, in leaders multiplying everywhere. And what was once fear is becoming respect. So here's the question. When all this truth comes to light, and it's coming, what will happen to the lies that held the world up until now? And if the truth is fully revealed, who will be able to silence the voices of millions who were silenced for centuries? For a long time, they told us African history didn't exist, that there were no records, no kings, that it was all folklore. But that was a lie. The truth always existed. It was just hidden, buried in ignored documents, silenced chants, dusty manuscripts, voices no one wanted to hear. But now, the truth has grown too loud to silence. Today, in universities across Brazil, Africa, and the world, researchers are translating the manuscripts of Timbuktu, cross-referencing archaeological data, rebuilding genealogies, and listening to griots, traditional storytellers. And what they're discovering is something we've always felt in our hearts, but never saw in the books. Africans had complex civilizations, rich cultures, ancient religions, and kings as powerful as any European. Online, young black people are telling the stories schools never taught. Videos, podcasts, Instagram and TikTok profiles, indie series and films, all bringing back forgotten figures, silenced voices, symbols buried by official history. And the impact is real. For the first time, black children are hearing that they come from kingdoms, not from slave quarters. Anti-racist educators are changing how history is taught. Instead of starting black history with slavery, they're starting with empires. They're explaining the slave trade as part of a larger project of dehumanization, not just an isolated event. They're giving black students back something that was stolen, the right to see themselves as powerful. Cultural movements are part of this reconstruction too. Black history museums like Museu Afro-Brazil in São Paulo or the Museum of the African Diaspora in Salvador are gathering artifacts, documents, and objects that challenge centuries of erasure. They are temples of living memory, where every object says, "You existed, and you were great." In samba schools, in toreros, in Afro blocks, in the favelas, in slam poetry circles, in jongo dances, in graffiti on the walls, and in the lyrics of rap, the truth is being sung, danced, written, and painted. Art has become the bridge between a silenced past and the future being built. Where once there was fear, now there is affirmation. The African diaspora is connecting. Black people in Brazil, Haiti, the US, Angola, Nigeria, Cuba, Colombia, Senegal, all separated by the ocean, but united by the same heritage and the same pain. And from this shared pain rises a collective force to rewrite history with their own hands. What was once a secret is now a shout. What was once shame is now pride. What was once shadow now shines. African royalty didn't disappear. It was hidden behind a curtain, and now that curtain is falling. The truth didn't just survive. It came back hungry for justice. Every time a black child learns that a queen like Nzinga existed, that a man like Mansa Musa was richer than any European, that there were libraries in Timbuktu while Europe was in darkness, something changes forever inside them. What was silence becomes strength. What was doubt becomes clarity. What was invisible becomes impossible to ignore. And the most beautiful part? This truth doesn't belong only to black people. It's part of humanity. It corrects a historical lie. It restores the dignity of a people, yes, but it also teaches the world that justice begins with recognizing what was hidden. Now that the truth is being told, who will have the courage to silence it again? But after all this, what do we do with this truth? How do we turn memory into action, pain into dignity, and history into pride? You've heard of black kings and queens. You've learned about empires, wars, resistance. You've seen the pain in the ships, the silence in the slave quarters, the fear of black power. You've understood how an entire story was erased to maintain a system. But now, after everything, one question still echoes. What do we do with this truth? The answer isn't in the books, it's in you. Because truth alone doesn't change the world. What changes the world is what we do with it. And when a people learns they descend from royalty, they stop living like slaves. When a black girl realizes she comes from queens, she doesn't let anyone take her dignity. The crown doesn't need to be returned, it needs to be recognized. The king is alive. Not in the palaces of Europe, but in the fierce gaze of those who survived everything and are still standing, in the wisdom of the grandmother who teaches through stories, in the boy from the favela who dreams of becoming a doctor, in the black woman who wakes up early and moves the world, in the street artist who turns pain into poetry. Black royalty has spread. It lives anywhere memory still beats. You, who grew up thinking your story began in a slave hut, now you know, it began long before that. It began in ancient kingdoms, in palaces made of clay and gold, in names they tried to erase, but that still live in your skin, your blood, your way of walking. Being descended from kings and queens isn't about vanity, it's about identity. It's about knowing that your existence is a continuation, that your skin carries an ancient, sacred, indestructible code. And when you look in the mirror and recognize your ancestry, you break history's greatest fear, the fear that you'll discover who you really are. Black dignity is indestructible. It was whipped, denied, ignored, silenced, but never killed, because every black body born after slavery is a response to that attempt at erasure. It's living proof that the colonial project failed at one essential thing. It couldn't kill the soul. And if the soul survived, then the future belongs to it. The story they told about us isn't the only one. And now it won't be the last, because we are writing a new one, a story where African kings are no longer legend, where black queens are no longer myth. They are mirrors, they are beacons, they are you. Does this truth make people uncomfortable? Yes, because it shifts power. Because it shatters the myth of inferiority, because it raises thrones out of ruins. But truth also sets people free. And once a people is free, they never kneel again. The king is alive. In every act of pride, in every raised afro, in every African-rooted religion practiced with love, in every anti-racist lesson, in every museum, in every book written by black hands. The king is alive because he never died. They just tried to bury him in silence. Now that you know, what will you do with this? Will you hide it, forget it, or will you lift your head like someone who finally sees their own throne? You are not the descendant of slaves. You are the descendant of kings who were kidnapped, and no one will ever erase that truth again.